Hi, we're here now with Claudia Isaac, Associate Professor in Community and Regional Planning at the University of New Mexico. Claudia's specialties are community development, community-based planning, and Claudia teaches our planning theory course. So she is the first class that all of our entering students
Indeed.
take. So Claudia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that planning theory class.
Sure. I call it the introduction, but also the indoctrination class. It lets students know how we approach planning in our program, our community-based approach, locating that within a long history, over 200 years of history of planning practice and thought. So we go through the various events in history that lead to new ways of thinking about planning. We talk about how students can locate themselves. I call it the Rubik's Cube. You've got a paradigm, you've got a content area, you've got a philosophical base, and all of that comes together in your location in this map of what planning is.
What is planning?
My relatives still don't know. And indeed, people have said planning is everything from applied social science, which means nothing, to very specific and narrow definitions. It's about the physical construction of space, or it's about economic structuring, and those are too narrow. So what we in fact do is locate where different kinds of philosophies, how they define planning. So for instance, there's a new emerging planning paradigm called, I call it the identity paradigm. And it looks at planning as those ways that communities, self-identified or socially constructed communities, determine how they're going to flourish and survive in larger society, how to protect themselves from erasure, how to preserve what they want to preserve, but also determine ways to change what they want to change. That's a fairly broad definition of planning, but there are a couple of things that are really specific about it. One is that it's place-based, that when we talk about planning, at least modern planning, we're talking about how people live in a place and how they transform that place, again, to preserve what you want to preserve and to change what you want to change. How to flourish in an environment, how to keep your social networks and social capital together, how to make sure that you're not being encroached upon and stolen from. In other words, unable to have a right livelihood because other people are transferring your value away from your community to others. Others define it as a rational, comprehensive process where it's sort of, I call it the just the facts, ma'am approach to planning, that there are technical things, we can learn them rigorously, scientifically, positivistly, and then we'll know what's good for society. Planning is also always about identifying the public interest, identifying threats to the public interest, and then working collectively to find ways to enhance the public interest. Now that sounds really simple, except that everybody defines every single one of those terms differently. So we spend a semester exploring that intellectual history, exploring that pragmatic history, what have planners done over the years, and then helping the students locate themselves within that history so that they can become reflective practitioners. Donald Schoen, the late wonderful Donald Schoen, talked about reflective practice as a double loop learning. You go in with a set of a priori assumptions. They're grounded. You have your experience, you have your academic knowledge, all of that has led to your a priori assumptions, but then you engage those assumptions in practice. And a wonderful thing happens. You not only use that theory to make better practice, but you use the practice, the experience, to elevate it into evidence to transform the theory, so that the reflective practitioner is always growing, always developing, always becoming a better planner, and I think a better human being and citizen, but that's just me.
So process sounds like is a really important part of this.
It's a very important part of it. We can get trapped in process. We always know about the co-optive processes that kept people so involved in talking to each other that they never actually solve the problems that they want to solve. So for planning, in my view, it's about that delicate discourse between process and product, and making sure you never lose sight of what it is you're trying to achieve, even as you're changing what you're trying to achieve as you learn from your practice. The process is what keeps you moving in the right direction towards a practice that has meaning and outcomes that are valuable.
And that outcome is something you come to by virtue of thinking about what it is you want to preserve, what it is you want to change.
Exactly,
And so
exactly.
part of the training involves working with students so that they learn how to work with communities to take them through a process towards an outcome.
Exactly, and that's really key. It's not just what we as planners want to preserve and change, and a lot of programs in planning really do emphasize on the planner as the actor. I think, at least my teaching fits within the planning pedagogy in that we are helping a community facilitate its own social learning, its own, building on its own assets, its own strengths, its own analytical capacity that members might not even have known that they had in order to solve those problems and move forward.
Thus the notion of community-based planning.
Precisely, yes.
Sounds like context is also very important.
Well, it is and it isn't. Sometimes it is, and depending on the paradigm that students locate themselves in, for instance, the identity planning paradigm is all about context. But we also have students that come from a policy analysis perspective that purposely attempts to distance the planning analysis from the context in order to find deeper meaning. It's a point of view that has been really dominant in planning in the rational comprehensive planning approach that has been critiqued and rightfully so, but I also think that students who are reflective about that can learn how to use that analytical distance to their own and the community's benefit. So sometimes you need to back away from context in order to be able to understand context.
You think there's room for rational planning even in an identity planning framework?
Well, we don't have enough time. And I think that there is always room for a rational approach. The question is, and this, we can go back to the 19th century feminists and the post-colonial theorists, depends on how you define rationality. One of the things that I really like, and I'm talking about the identity paradigm because that's one of my research interests right now. There's also social learning, which assumes that starting from Dewey and the experiential knowledge perspective, that everybody has a theory, they just don't always articulate it that way. That's all about process. That's all about digging deep to find out what that theory is and act on it. And social mobilization of having an active political agenda to bring about positive social transformation. Those three tend to interact with each other quite well, and one of the things I want students to be able to do is to talk to people who are rational comprehensive planners and really can't understand why everybody's spending all their time schmoozing with each other instead of doing the real work. I want them to be able to talk to those folks. I want them to be able to talk to identity planners who may be very, very entrenched in a particular community outlook that is quite different from that of not only the planner, but other communities around it. I want them to be able to talk with social reform planners who are grand visionaries and have their utopian vision of what society should be, and be able to identify those points of common ground, even if they disagree on 99.9%. I want them to be able to talk across that 0.1% that they have in common.
And then also to be able to understand things from the point of view of those,
Precisely.
of those individuals in order to engage with them.
Which requires a certain empathy that I think is part of learning planning. You can't, I think, be a good community-based planner if you don't have well-developed skills in empathy.
And in that class, they do case studies, don't they?
Yes, they do. We could spend all of our time reading deep theory and philosophy, and it would be huge fun. But they're not going to get that double loop part unless they can really apply that learning to real life, not necessarily real time, but real life cases in the Albuquerque area. So the content that students are choosing between are three concentrations: physical planning, community development, natural resources planning. The paradigms I've already listed. How they engage that practice has to do with the role that they choose to play as planners, what they actually are doing on the ground as planners. So for instance, we talk about planners as regulators. And in fact, when I talk to my relatives, they assume that either I'm writing zoning laws or I'm digging up sewers or something. But figuring out how do you write regulation that is robust, that's solid, that's reasoned, and that reflects community will. And it's usually a multiple and complex community whose will is not always all that convergent. How do you write that kind of regulation? Well, how you write it depends on which paradigm you're coming from and what content area you're working in. We talk about planner as designer. We talk about planner as public sector developer, an increasingly important role, particularly in affordable housing and affordable commercial and redevelopment. We talk about planner as mediator, a relatively recent role that planners have played. But how do you've got this multiple and complex, multiplex identity in a community. How do you mediate the differences within it? We talk about planner as organizer. How do you get folks to understand how to transform their unease and discomfort and anger into positive action? I forgot one role, but we'll leave it at that.
It's pretty close, and they come out of there having some notion of how they would see themselves in one of these roles or multiple roles.
They at least have a starting point, and I remind them that planning, like any other intellectual endeavor or practical endeavor, is like building grooves in your head. That the first time you hear it, it makes no sense, but it left a tiny little groove in your head. The next time you hear it, a deeper groove. By the end of the semester, their grooves are at least solid. None of them, and in fact, I hope that none of them are absolutely fixed, because the whole point is to be a reflective practitioner for the rest of our lives.
And to continue that engagement process. Well, you mentioned that we have 3 emphases in our program, the community development, natural resource planning, and the physical planning and urban design. On the community development, that's your
Yes, it is.
expertise, your emphasis. One of the other courses that you take that students totally love is your community-based practice class. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that class.
Sure. That course came about because I tend to be a theory person, and students were saying, we're learning all of this theory, but we don't know how to use it on the ground. And so I had been doing research on community activists, doing oral histories with them. How do they identify themselves in their communities? And increasingly, those conversations went to, okay, so what do you do in the day? Right? You show up and you do something. What is it? And how do you assess the effectiveness of your own practice? So that class is divided, the semester is divided into 3 sections. The first is community building. How do we understand community, again, from different points of view? How do we understand other people's definitions of community? How do we engage with those understandings? The second is organization building, and we spend a lot of time talking about nonprofit organizations, not because all of our students end up working in them, but many of them do, and I think most will end up engaging with nonprofit organizations, either from the private sector or from the governmental sector or from within the nonprofit sector. And it takes some effort and skill to know how to make an organization work. And very often we're drawn to the mission of the organization without actually knowing how to manage one. So we spend a good third of the semester talking about fundamentals like how do you do fundraising as a social justice organization. Our usual instinct is to say, I don't want to talk to corporations, but, well, they have money and they might actually believe in your mission. How do you engage them in a way that doesn't undermine your mission? The third part is very student-driven, and that's the capacity building component. I think that community-based practice is composed of those 3 elements, and communities have certain assets and capacities available to them. Planners can facilitate in identifying those assets and working with them, but when it gets down to it, if you're doing environmental justice organizing, you need to know something about how pollution plumes flow. You have to have the content. And so students drive that third part of the semester. They
Based on their interest.
Based on their interest. They choose a topic, a project. It's usually fictive because they're often first-year students, and I want them to have time to, in many of my classes, I want students to have the opportunity to fail miserably, because that's the safe place to fail miserably. So, for instance, students have done things like develop a major donor fundraising program for a nonprofit social justice organization. Another student did a curriculum for deaf and hearing participants in a deaf space mobilization organization. Other students have worked with acequia associations and farmers to try to get their interests aligned and help them move forward in a strategy or a campaign. So they've been working on all of those, from the community building and the organization building component, all the way through the first 2 parts of the semester. In the 3rd part of the semester, each of them come and teach a workshop as though they were doing it in the community around their topic that helps build the class's capacity around that topic. So for instance, a student who was looking at the feasibility of establishing an Albuquerque chapter of the Navajo Nation taught us about kinship and location and proximity, and what does it mean to be a multi-kinned chapter, which was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot. One of the things I like about this class is that I learn a tremendous amount from the students.
And at the same time, you're building their capacity.
Yes.
Yeah, they're
Yes.
to do the community development work.
Yeah.
So part of and that's part of the pedagogy too, is that they're also teaching one another.
Yes. In my philosophy, if I've done a class well, I have a lot of directive control at the beginning and none at the end. That I teach them how to teach themselves over the course of the semester, so that by the end of the semester, I'm just a participant. And in fact, in community-based practice, I am just a participant with everybody else.
That's a successful class.
It's wonderful. It's a great experience.
One of the things that we also do in our program is we require a second methods beyond the analytical methods class that everyone has to take their second semester in the program. One of the second methods classes that you teach for the community development folks is your qualitative methods class.
Yes.
Another one of those really successful courses that everybody raves about.
Thank you.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that course.
That's also a very hands-on focused class. And the idea is that there are epistemological questions that students really need to understand what's different about rigor and qualitative research as opposed to rigor and quantitative research. Most of us have been educated as quantitative thinkers, whether we know it or not. And the usual logical syllogisms assume some kind of mathematical rigor underneath, some structure underneath. Well, narrative data, qualitative data doesn't have that structure. And so the challenge is to learn how to collect data, understand it, interpret it, analyze it in a way that mines the nuance of that narrative data without implying statistical regularity. So for instance, I never allow students to count anything in qualitative methods. I mean, it may be useful and interesting to know that 10 people said that and 4 people said that, but it makes mathematically absolutely no sense because you don't have a random sample to know whether this actually represents a population. What you do know is that these people, this group of people, somewhat larger than the other group, have some sets of experiences that have led them to tell the same story. And this group has a different set of experiences that have led them to tell a different story about the same question.
So part of it is building their capacity to extract these stories.
Precisely. And to extract the stories themselves means learning how to do data collection in a way that recognizes that they are participants in that discourse. That it's not the analytical distance that we were talking about earlier, that unless you're really fully there, and understand how who you are is affecting how, I mean, just in this conversation, we're colleagues and we know each other and we have experiences together, and that is shaping the meaning that's being created here. If we were doing this in a quantitative way, you would have your questions already written out and you wouldn't change, right? The point here is that it's a discourse. And so the students learn how to do that.
And out of that discourse is an emergent product.
Is an emergent meaning, even more important. And that meaning is nuanced, complicated, often fragmented. The divergent triangulation is usually much more interesting than everybody agrees that this is the story. It's where you have different stories that you start to get at real meaning. And there's some questions that are really suited to qualitative analysis, and others that, I mean, I wouldn't ask a question about what's the preponderance of experience with this policy intervention, for instance, in a qualitative way, because it's a quantitative question. It's about counting. It's about finding that statistical rigor and order. We don't spend much time talking about those differences at the beginning, but I really want students to immerse themselves into what I call rigorous storytelling. And they also, in that class, work on a project over the course of the semester, develop a conceptual framework, develop a research protocol, collect multiple kinds of data, interview data, individual and group, collective analysis or workshop kind of data, observation, visual analysis, social network analysis. And then they spend the last part of the semester doing triangulation, learning the software to be able to make sure you haven't, because you didn't really like that answer, leave it out, right? You make sure that you're systematic in your assessment of the data. And then come up with some kind of community-based product that will communicate that analysis to a larger audience.
You know, one of the things about planning is it really requires us to be able to figure out a lot of complexity. And it sounds like this course is really helpful in helping students wade through all the complex stories.
Yes.
And make sense out of those stories. And you provide sort of the analytical pathway to do that.
That's my hope,
Oh,
yes.
good. You've also taught Latin American studies?
Yes.
Latin American development, women in development?
Yes, yes. And I have to admit that my research is no longer focused in Latin America, so I
But you
use
did your PhD from UCLA on the co-ops in Mexico.
women's production co-ops in Mexico. I was interested in how women either controlled or didn't control their own labor process in these cooperatives, and the role of planning agencies and other government agencies in either facilitating women's local knowledge or undermining it. It was great fun research, but that was, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago, because it'll tell you how old I am. Increasingly, my research is based here in the United States. So I use those classes to keep myself current in Latin American literature. And I rely a lot on the experiences of my students to bring that contemporary experiential knowledge in.
Well, and we have a joint degree with Latin American
Yes, we do.
Studies,
We do.
And you are the
I'm the coordinator of that. Yes.
So we have a lot of students who are getting the dual degree, or maybe they're majoring in Latin American Studies, but getting an emphasis with
Yes,
community
there are two ways to do that. You can either do the dual degree, in which case you will be a planner who has a Latin American expertise. That is, you can engage as a professional, as a practitioner in planning, and the concentration in Latin American studies enables students to engage with planning, but they don't have all of the technical or, methodological skills that a planner would have.
You've mentioned several times your research, and you've talked about your identity research, and I know you've done a lot of interviewing and a lot of work here in Albuquerque. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of your research.
Sure. What interests me about identity is that people talk about community identity with the wildest disregard for any kind of common meaning. And often community identity has been framed as a form of branding, as a construction, as something that planners create. And that's not particularly interesting to me. What's interesting to me is how self-identified communities identify themselves. And often my particular interest is in low-income communities of color who have survived in environments of not just encroachment, but erasure, and have had a very difficult time both maintaining and growing that identity. One of the things that always bugs me is this tendency to assume that identity is some historical artifact that you either embrace or you must be not that identity anymore. But identity is something that moves and flows and changes and becomes hybrid, to use Ray Rocco's term. Rearticulates itself. And so my interest is how working class communities of color use identity as a means of consolidating and confirming and building social capital. And I use social capital, although I recognize that there are a lot of problems with that term, and I try to clarify that in my writing. But I use social capital on purpose because that means that it's capital. It can be used, it's utilitarian. And particularly in communities.
As a set of assets, too.
Yes, well, precisely. And when you don't have fiscal assets and you're disinvested and nobody has been repairing the roads forever, what you have to rely on is social capital. And identity is one of those things that helps to convene social capital. It helps to build those relationships of reciprocity and mutual care that allows social capital to grow. The other thing that interests me about identity is a little more pointy-headed. I mentioned the planning paradigms earlier. Well, John Friedman, who is your go-to guy for planning theory, who I was very lucky to be able to work with.
You studied with him at UCLA.
Yes. He wrote a wonderful book called Planning in the Public Domain, in which he traced the intellectual history of planning as of 1987, when he wrote that book, and identified 4 planning paradigms. And the 2 kind of progressive ones were social learning and social mobilization. But it became really clear through the 70s and 80s that there was a whole component of planning practice and a whole component of the communities within which planners were working that social learning and social mobilization weren't capturing. And that was that people really do rely on social capital. They really do rely on their identity, derived historically, derived culturally, derived in terms of their shared class experiences. All of those together constitute identity that is quintessentially formative for how people actually manage to solve their community problems. And in the 1980s, some wonderful planning theorists like June Manning Thomas, like Leonie Sandercock, more recently Karen Umamoto at University of Manoa, of Hawaii Manoa, you, and me a little bit, I'm getting into this, but the idea is that planners have been insurgent in surfacing that identity thread in ways that the mainstream literature hasn't always recognized. But now, that identity planning theory is coming into its own. And I think that it's a really exciting paradigmatic shift in planning that I want to document and be part of.
Well, and as I hear you speak about it too, it's not only do I feel the excitement of it, but how profound it is. You know, when you think about all the social issues, all the economic issues that our families and our communities are facing, you know, the idea of from a organizing or a strategic or a mobilizing kind of view, how do we build, harness, protect those relations, right?
Yes.
Because even in the field of education, for example, people like Angela Valenzuela, Pedro Noguera have talked about the importance of caring.
Yes.
Right, and that's part of what those social networks do, and it's part of what I think we're facing right now in this era of incivility, for example, even within our political realm, as an erosion of the caring fabric. And yet, caring is what's going to really link us all together, right, and form those communities.
It certainly is, and it becomes even more complex when we realize that social capital isn't always about caring. I mean, gossip convenes social capital better than just about anything I can think of. So we have complicated social organizations that we need to learn more about how to engage in a productive and positive way, rather than in the often backbiting, nitpicky, horrible ways that they can.
That incivility, right? Once again, pointing to, I think, your connection you made earlier between process and product.
Yes.
Thinking through
exactly.
what is that product we really want to get to
Precisely.
as we build communities, so that what we do in the course of getting there really matters.
Precisely.
Very
Yes.
exciting. So you've been writing about that. That's great.
Yes. In the middle of my practice,
And
which
your practice has been very focused on affordable housing too, has it not?
affordable housing. I
Strategic
also
planning.
strategic planning, public education around planning issues, and increasingly evaluation from the empowerment and participatory evaluation perspective. And it's all about those 3 elements of community-based practice that I mentioned earlier: community building, organization building, and capacity building. I want to engage in all of those practices because it enhances and feeds my teaching constantly, and also enhances and feeds my research. And I believe in community-based participatory research whereby all of us are creating knowledge together. It's not just my knowledge as an academic that I then go publish, but that we work together, the community who invites me to help facilitate that process, and me who brings my analytical eye to the question. And our dissemination isn't necessarily in peer-reviewed journals. What we want to measure is impact, which is why I got into evaluation. How was this innovative? How was this interesting? What did we learn from the mistakes? How would we do it differently next time? How do we use this to network with other people who are engaged in similar kinds of activities, to teach each other our stories? How do we affect policy? For me, that's the kind of impact that I want as a scholar. And, you know, it's nice when my colleagues in the academy read it too, but it's the on-the-ground kind of public intellectual impact that I'm much more interested in.
Well, and I think your colleagues do, and certainly I think this community recognizes the talents and the impacts that you've had along these lines. If we can go back for a minute, I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about strategic planning, for example, because that's one of those talents that you have that a lot of people draw upon. So what is it that, and we like to emphasize that in planning, so what, especially in community-based planning, so what is it do you think that makes a good facilitator of a process? What are some of those ingredients of a good facilitator? I think you've alluded to a lot of them already.
That's a harder one to answer. I think I know, but it's a harder one to put into words. I think that a good facilitator, well, first is a listener. And not in the facile kind of, I got all of the words, but a deep listener. Almost using Clifford Geertz's thick description, to understand the deep knowledge that's being expressed, often in terms that are not particularly erudite, but the meaning is. Being able to understand in a deep way what people are saying is the first skill of a good facilitator. And that means being able to read body language, being able to listen and observe around the edges and how are people responding in a way that's not manipulative, but actually really truly is learning from that listening. I think that a good facilitator, I'm an active facilitator. I rarely take on facilitation, or certainly not strategic planning tasks where I don't have some background in the field. And I know that there are others who disagree with me. There are others who really believe that they should be completely hands-off so that the participants have full control over the process. But I think that a good facilitator can bring her or his experiential and analytical knowledge to bear on what she or he is hearing and help build those little bridges. I'm hearing this and I'm hearing this and I'm wondering if what connects them is this. So that as a facilitator, you bring that, you're not pushing it, but you're listening really carefully and then bringing what you know to help make those connections.
So the mind is always working as you're listening.
Yeah, you get tired at the end of a facilitation.
It's hard work to facilitate. It's hard work. Do you want to say something also about your affordable housing work?
That's mostly through serving on boards of community-based organizations like the Sawmill Community Land Trust. We just had a big celebration that was exciting.
Very successful.
Yes. The Supportive Housing Coalition, the Albuquerque Affordable Housing Coalition. My interest actually didn't start out there as housing. My interest was how are people coming together around this issue? And what do I have to contribute to that? And housing, particularly both wealth creation and permanent affordability, kept coming up as oppositional concepts. That if you're going to help a community build wealth, then you want housing prices to rise, for instance, because you want poor people to get assets. Absolutely legitimate concept, especially given the FHA rules and all of the structural barriers that were in place to keep poor people and people of color from benefiting from affordable housing programs in from the 40s through the 70s. On the other side, permanent affordability argues that until we've solved the problem of poverty, which is, in my view, that's, if you ask what my primary concern is, it's poverty alleviation. And everything else connects to that. So unless we've completely alleviated poverty, then wealth creation is simply channeling money away from communities, especially as people who tend to realize that new asset, they sell it and they move away. So that asset moves out of the community. Well, that had been framed in a really oppositional way. Either you were talking about wealth creation or you were talking about permanent affordability. And what interests me still is, and I think we're moving in that direction, is how to bring those two together in a mix of policies and programs and kinds of development that will make sure that poor people aren't made homeless and we'll make sure that people who frankly deserve reparations for having been excluded from highly subsidized wealth creation in other communities get that chance. I won't say that we've solved that problem.
And you talk a lot about community economic issues in your community economics for planners class.
Yes, I do.
Another one of those classes that I think really is very exciting for students. And
Well, it's a blast to teach.
yeah,
I make students wear the hat of three theorists: Maynard Keynes, Karl Marx, and either Friedrich Hayek if we're talking about the Depression era, or Milton Friedman if we're talking about the 80s and on, well, 70s and on. And the reason I do that is that it sort of gets back to my approach to planning theory. I want them to understand how a reasoned, reasonable, not evil person would hold the position that they really, really, really disagree with. And I want them to learn how to be really critical of that position that they are
Immediately drawn to. And so, in addition,
that critical thinking always.
precisely. And compassion. I mean, it's this combination of critical thinking and empathy that I think makes for a good reflective practitioner. And so that's what I try in all of my classes to teach students how to do. So we do the readings, we read the texts we start with macroeconomic kinds of principles and globalization, and then we get down to the nuts and bolts of, last week's class was on enterprise development. So we go from very big to very specific.
And various strategies that they can employ in a community
Precisely,
approach.
yeah. But they have to do that wearing different hats, and they have to switch their hats from time to time. So we do role plays. I've never done one of Keynes, Friedman, and Marx walk into a bar, but I should come up with something like that.
Recently we did Keynes, Friedman, and Marx are all working for a council of governments, and they all have to come up with an enterprise development strategy.
Well, you're really pushing their brains.
I'm
That's
making
great.
them do that, and I
That's
sometimes have to
fantastic.
remind them to wear the hat.
Uh-huh.
If you're playing Keynes, but you're a Marxist, then you need to know how you're going to critique, from a Keynesian point of view, Marx. If you are wearing the hat of Marx and you're a neoliberal, you need to know how Marxists would critique Friedman. It's a blast. I
Sounds
really
like it.
enjoy that class.
Sounds like it. Sounds like all of the classes and all of the programs and your research are really part of what makes CRP a very, very exciting program, a very exciting place to be a faculty member, a very exciting place to be a student.
Well, thank you, and I certainly do find it an exciting place to be.
Thank you, Claudia. Claudia Isaac, Associate Professor, Community Regional Planning at the University of New Mexico.